The city was a cage, and Grace was a bird with clipped wings. For 20 years she'd lived in the corners of other people's lives, a quiet shadow in a world of brick and noise. Orphaned, forgotten, and handed off to a cousin who saw her as just another mouth to feed. Her days were a blur of chores. Her nights were spent in a cold little room under the eaves, with only her mother's worn-out Bible for warmth. In its pages, she didn't just find scripture. She found a whisper. A promise from God that he hadn't forgotten her, even if everyone else had. One afternoon, her cousin tossed a newspaper on the table. "For girls like you," she sniffed. No prospects. It was the matrimonial section. Ads from men out west, looking for wives. Grace felt a hot flush of shame. A mail-order bride. It was the last stop for the desperate. But later, in the quiet of her room, a different feeling took root. A tiny, fragile seed of hope. Maybe this wasn't an act of desperation. Maybe it was a door. That night, she knelt on the hard floorboards. "Heavenly Father," she whispered into the dark, "if this is your path for me, let it be. Guide my hands, give my heart a home." A sense of peace settled over her, and she knew. She penned a response to one ad in particular. A man named Levi, a rancher in the Wyoming Territory. His words weren't flowery. They were hard, practical. He was a widower with a young daughter. He needed a woman of good character to manage his home. He offered security, a roof over her head, and respect. But his heart, he wrote, was buried with his late wife. He was offering a partnership, not a romance. The brutal honesty felt safe. It was an arrangement, a duty she could understand. After a few more letters, a train ticket arrived. Her journey west was a symphony of steam and steel, the world outside her window changing from green fields to a sky so big it stole her breath. She clutched her small suitcase and prayed for courage. Out on that sprawling Wyoming ranch, Levi stood on his porch and stared at the empty road. He was a man carved from the landscape itself, strong, silent, weathered by a sorrow that had hollowed him out. The loss of his wife 2 years ago had left him a shell, a man just going through the motions. His only reason for living was his little girl, Rosie, but even that love was tangled up in a fierce, protective fear. He'd told Rosie a lady named Grace was coming to help around the house. "Be polite," he'd said, "but remember, she is here to work. Do not pester her." He couldn't bear the thought of another attachment, another chance for heartbreak. The stagecoach arrived in a cloud of dust. Grace stepped down, her best dress wrinkled, her legs unsteady. Then she saw him. He was taller than she'd imagined, his face handsome but set in stone. He gave a short, formal nod. "Miss Grace, I'm Levi." There was no smile, no warmth in his blue eyes, just a cool appraisal, as if he were inspecting a new piece of equipment. Her heart, which had been fluttering with hope, dropped like a stone. She was utterly alone, 1,000 miles from home, with a man who looked right through her. The ride to the ranch was a long, crushing silence. He pointed out landmarks in a clipped tone. The creek, the north pasture. The ranch house was a sturdy log structure, but to Grace, it felt like a cage. He helped her down, his grip strong and impersonal. "This is your room. Supper is at 6. And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the unfamiliar space. The silence of the house pressed in on her. The vast, empty sky that had once seemed so full of promise now felt terrifyingly lonely. Had she heard God's call correctly? Or had she just followed a whisper of desperation into a new kind of prison? A single tear cut a path through the dust on her cheek. She wiped it away, afraid of the sound of her own sadness. The next morning, the stark Wyoming light felt like a judgment. This was her life now. The house was cold and silent, the wind groaning outside her window like a restless spirit. She lay in the narrow bed, the weight of her choice pressing down on her chest. Levi's cold, impassive face was all she could see. But then, a verse from her mother's Bible surfaced in her mind. I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee. She wasn't alone. Not really. With a new resolve, she rose and dressed. She would not crumble. She had made a promise. She found the main room empty and set about building a fire, her hands clumsy in the unfamiliar kitchen. The place was well stocked but felt cold, a place of function, not warmth. She was mixing biscuits when a small sound made her turn. A little girl with wide, serious blue eyes and a tumble of honey-colored curls was peeking around the doorframe. Rosie. She clutched a worn rag doll like a shield. Good morning, Grace said softly. The little girl didn't speak. She just stared. Grace tried a different approach, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. Would you like to help me? I need a very good helper to pat out these biscuits. For a long moment, the girl just watched her, scrutinizing her. Then, she gave a tiny, solemn nod and padded into the room. Levi walked in just as they were placing the biscuits on a pan. He stopped dead in the doorway. His gaze went from the fire to the table, and then to his daughter, her hands dusty with flour. An unreadable emotion flickered in his eyes, there and gone in an instant. The hands eat in the bunkhouse, he said, his voice a low rumble. Just set for the three of us. He didn't thank her. He didn't comment on his daughter's happy face. He just sat down, and the meal began in a silence so thick you could cut it with a knife. After Levi left for the day, the house seemed to breathe again. Rosie, freed from her father's oppressive sadness, became a different child. She trailed after Grace, her curiosity bubbling to the surface. Grace turned the chores into adventures, telling Bible stories as they swept, tales of courage and faith. In the afternoon, Grace brought out her mother's Bible. Would you like me to read you a story from it? Rosie nodded, climbing onto the sofa and leaning her small head against Grace's arm. The gesture of trust was so sudden, so pure, it brought a lump to Grace's throat. It was the first real comfort she'd felt. But as the days fell into a rhythm, Grace started to notice things. Rosie would never speak of her mother. Not a word. If Grace asked a gentle question, the girl would freeze, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear, and she would run from the room. And Levi. His silence wasn't just grief. It was something harder, something angrier. Sometimes Grace would catch him staring out at the creek, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight with a fury that seemed to have no source. One evening, after putting Rosie to bed, Grace was tidying the girl's room. Tucked away under the small cot, she found a little wooden chest. It was locked. Curiosity got the better of her. She found a hairpin and worked the simple lock until it clicked open. Inside, there was nothing but a single object. A child's drawing. It showed 3 stick figures under a bright yellow sun. A tall man, a small girl, and a woman with long, dark hair. They were all holding hands and smiling. But the woman's face, it had been violently scribbled over with a dark crayon, completely blotted out. A chill ran down Grace's spine. This wasn't a house of quiet grief. It was a house of rage. Grace tucked the drawing back into the chest, her mind racing. The scribbled-out face haunted her. It was a child's act, yes, but it was filled with such violence. Rosie didn't just miss her mother. She was angry at her. The next morning, Grace tried to bring it up gently. Rosie, she began as they were feeding the chickens. I found a beautiful drawing you made. Of your family. The little girl went rigid. The basket of feed fell from her hands, scattering across the dirt. I didn't draw that, she whispered, her face pale. It's all right, sweetie, Grace said softly. It's a lovely picture of you and your papa and... She left! Rosie suddenly shrieked, her little body trembling. She left us! Papa said she went away! The words hit Grace like a physical blow. Went away? Not died? Levi had said he was a widower. He had written that his wife was buried. Had he lied? Before Grace could ask another question, Rosie turned and ran, disappearing into the barn. The conversation was over. That evening, the tension in the house was unbearable. Levi was even more silent than usual, his anger a palpable thing simmering just beneath the surface. Grace watched him, her mind a whirlwind of questions. Why would he lie about something so fundamental? The answer came a few days later, in the form of a visitor. A woman from a neighboring ranch, Martha, rode up with a basket of eggs and a face full of prying curiosity. She was the kind of woman who fed on gossip like a starving animal. "So you're the new one," Martha said, her eyes scanning every corner of the house. "Brave of you, I'll say, after what happened to the first one, to Sarah." "Mr. Levy told me his wife passed away," Grace said, trying to keep her voice steady. Martha let out a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, passed away is one way to put it, I suppose. Passed right out of this valley is more like it. In the middle of the night, no less." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What are you talking about?" "Sarah?" Martha leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She ran off. Left him and the child. Couldn't take the isolation, they say. Or maybe she couldn't take him." She shot a pointed look toward the barn where Levi was working. "He has a temper on him, that one. A dark streak. Sarah was a gentle thing. Probably scared her off." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Levi's rage, Rosie's confusion and anger, the scribbled-out drawing. It wasn't grief that filled this house. It was the shame of being abandoned. But why would Levi lie? Why invent a story about a grave? The lie was a cage, too. One he had built around himself and his daughter. He hadn't just lost his wife. He had been rejected. And the shame of it was a poison that had infected every part of their lives. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She felt like an intruder, a participant in a lie she never agreed to. She had come here seeking a partnership built on honesty, and had found herself in a house built on a foundation of deceit. She looked at her mother's Bible, its familiar comfort now feeling hollow. She had prayed for a home, and God had led her here. But to what end? To live a lie? To raise a child who believed her mother was dead when she was, in fact, alive somewhere in the world? The moral weight of it was crushing. She had to confront him. She had to know the truth. But as she rehearsed the words in her mind, a new, colder fear crept in. Martha's words echoed in her thoughts. He has a temper on him. A dark streak. What would a man who lied so easily about his wife's death do when he was confronted with his own deception? The sky began to darken the next afternoon, the brilliant blue turning a bruised, ominous purple. The wind started to howl, a frantic, angry sound. A storm was coming. Grace knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that another kind of storm was about to break inside the house. She had to know the truth. For Rosie's sake, and for her own. She found Levi in the barn, securing the horses against the coming gale. His movements were tense, agitated. "Levi," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "We need to talk." He didn't turn around. "About what?" "About Sarah, about your wife." He froze. He turned slowly, and the look on his face sent a jolt of pure fear through her. The quiet, stern man was gone. In his place was a stranger, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice dangerously low. "She's dead." "No, she's not," Grace whispered, clutching her hands together to keep them from trembling. "She left. She ran away. Why did you lie to me? Why are you lying to your daughter?" For a moment, he just stared at her, and she saw a flash of something in his eyes. Not just anger. Pain. a deep, raw agony that was terrifying to behold. Then the wall slammed back down, harder than ever. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snarled, taking a step toward her. "You come into my home, you play mother to my child, and you think you have the right to dig up the past?" "Rosie deserves to know the truth," Grace cried, finding a sudden strength in her conviction. "She's a child full of anger at a ghost. It's not fair to her." "You want to talk about fair?" he roared, his voice echoing in the cavernous barn. The horses shied nervously in their stalls. "Is it fair that she left her child? That she broke her vows and ran off without a word? I told Rosie her mother died because the truth is 1,000 times more cruel. The truth is her mother didn't want her." The sheer, brutal pain in his words stunned her into silence. "I gave her a grave so she could have a place to mourn," he continued, his voice cracking. "I buried a memory to protect her from a truth that would destroy her. And you come here and tear it all apart." He took another step, backing her against the rough wood of a stall. "You will not speak of this again. Not to me, and not to Rosie. Do you understand?" It wasn't a question. It was a threat. Grace looked into his eyes and saw not just a grieving man, but a man pushed to the very edge. Martha's warning screamed in her mind. A dark streak. Terrified, she did the only thing she could think to do. She turned and ran. She ran out of the barn and into the wind, which was now whipping the world into a frenzy of dust and stinging rain. She didn't have a destination. She just ran, away from the barn, away from the house, away from the man whose pain had twisted him into something unrecognizable. She ran toward the creek, the path already turning to mud under her feet. She didn't hear him shouting her name over the roar of the wind. She just ran, her heart pounding with a terror she had never known. The lie was one thing, but the rage behind it was something else entirely. The sky opened up. Rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. The world disappeared. And Grace was alone in the storm, running from a truth far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The storm was a living thing, a screaming beast of wind and water. Grace stumbled through the deluge, the path to the creek dissolving into a slick river of mud. Every crack of thunder sounded like Levi's furious voice. Every flash of lightning illuminated a world that had become hostile and alien. She finally found shelter in an old, dilapidated line shack, a relic from cattle drives long past. She collapsed onto the dirt floor in a shivering heap, soaked to the bone, her mind a chaotic whirl of fear and confusion. Levi's words echoed in her head. The truth is, her mother didn't want her. The cruelty of it was staggering. He wasn't just a liar. He was a man capable of a deep, calculated deception, all in the name of a twisted kind of protection. Back at the ranch, Levi stood in the rain, the fury draining out of him, replaced by a cold, sharp dread. He watched her disappear into the storm, and a terrifying sense of déjà vu washed over him. Not again. Please God, not again. This was how it had happened before. An argument, a storm, and a woman running out into the unforgiving wilderness. Without a second thought, he was on his horse, driving the animal into the teeth of the gale. The fear was a physical thing, a raw, screaming panic that clawed at his insides. But this fear was different. The fear he'd felt for Sarah had been laced with anger and betrayal. The fear he felt for Grace was something else. It was the terror of losing something essential. Something he hadn't even realized he'd come to depend on. He found her in the line shack, huddled in a corner, her arms wrapped around her knees. The relief that hit him was so powerful it almost buckled his legs. He stood in the doorway, rainwater streaming from his hat, his chest heaving. "Grace," he said, and her name was a prayer. A sob. She looked up, her eyes wide with fear. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the damp wall. "Stay away from me." The words cut him deeper than any knife. He took a slow step inside, holding up his hands. "I'm not going to hurt you. I came to bring you back." Back to what? She whispered, her voice trembling. Back to the lies? Back to the anger? He flinched as if she'd struck him. He deserved it. He deserved all of it. He sank down onto a dusty crate, the water pooling around his boots. The fight was gone. There was nothing left but the raw, ugly truth. It wasn't a fever, he said, his voice hollow. The story I told Rosie. The story I told you in my letters. He couldn't look at her. He stared at the dirt floor, at the story he had buried for 2 long years. It was a storm. Just like this one. He told her everything. He told her how Sarah had hated the ranch, the isolation, the endless work. How she had begged him to sell, to move back east. He told her about their final, terrible argument, how he had called her weak, how she had screamed that she would rather die than spend another day in this God-forsaken place. She ran out, he said, his voice breaking. Just like you did, into the storm. I was angry. I was proud. I let her go. I thought she'd come back when she cooled off. He finally looked up, his eyes swimming with a grief so profound it was almost unwatchable. But she didn't cool off. The creek, it floods fast. They found her the next day, miles downstream. The official report said it was an accident, but it wasn't. I killed her, Grace. My pride, my stubbornness. I drove her out into that storm. I as good as killed her. The secret was out. Not a story of abandonment, but a story of guilt. A guilt so heavy it had crushed the man he used to be. The lie he told Rosie wasn't to protect her from a mother who didn't want her. It was to protect her from a father who believed he was a monster. Grace stared at him, the fear in her heart slowly being replaced by a wave of overwhelming compassion. The angry tyrant in the barn was gone. In his place was a broken man, drowning in a sea of self-hatred. He had built a fortress of lies not to keep the world out, but to keep his own guilt caged within. The ride back to the ranch was made in a silence charged with the weight of his confession. He wrapped his coat around her, his arm holding her securely against his chest. It wasn't a gesture of ownership, but of protection. A desperate attempt to do for her what he had failed to do for Sarah. That evening, after Rosie was asleep, they sat by the fire. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. I owe you an apology, he began, his voice rough. A real one. I brought you here under false pretenses. I was a coward. I was so afraid of this, of having to face what I did. I thought if I never cared for anyone again, I could never hurt anyone again. He knelt before her chair, a gesture of profound humility. But you brought light back into this house. You gave my daughter her laughter back. And when I thought I had lost you in that storm, the fear was unbearable. Because I realized that you have become essential. Tears welled in Grace's eyes. Tears of sorrow for the pain he had carried, and tears of a strange, unexpected joy. I cannot offer you the past, Grace, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I am asking if you would be willing to help me build a future, a real one, an honest one, not as my hired hand, but as my partner, my friend. Can we please start over? She placed her hand on his, her touch warm and sure. Yes, Levi, she whispered. I would like that very much. In the warm, fire-lit silence, the fortress around the rancher's heart didn't just melt. It crumbled into dust. Starting over was a delicate, deliberate process. Honesty became the new foundation of their home. Levi, with Grace by his side, sat down with Rosie and told her the truth. Not the brutal lie he'd told himself, but a gentler version. He told her that her mother had been very sad and that she had gotten lost in a terrible storm. He told her it was an accident and that he missed her every day. For the first time, he cried in front of his daughter. And Rosie, with a child's simple wisdom, wrapped her small arms around his neck and cried with him. The scribbled-out drawing was brought out, and together, they looked at the smiling woman with the dark hair. The ghost was finally given a name, and a place for her memory to rest peacefully. The change in Levi was profound. The weight of his secret had been a crushing burden, and with it lifted, he became a different man. The hard edges softened. He started to smile, small, tentative smiles at first, that grew more frequent and genuine. He began to talk, to share stories of his own childhood on the ranch, to ask Grace about her life before she came west. He began to court her. Properly. It started with small things. A wildflower left on her pillow. A compliment on her cooking. Then came buggy rides in the long summer evenings, the golden light painting the valley in hues of amber and rose. They talked for hours, not as a rancher and his housekeeper, but as two people discovering each other. He learned of her quiet, unshakable faith, of the strength she drew from it. She learned of his deep love for the land, a love that was woven into his very soul. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars ignite in the vast velvet sky, he took her hand. His own was large and calloused, but his touch was gentle. "Grace," he began, his voice solemn, "when you came here, this house was filled with ghosts and lies. You exorcised them. You brought truth and light back into my life. You saved me, and you saved my daughter." He turned to face her, his blue eyes clear and full of an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I promised you a partnership, but my heart is asking for much more. It's asking for a real marriage, a union before God, built on the love and respect I have for you. Grace, will you do me the profound honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of pure joy streamed down Grace's face. This was the answer to a prayer she hadn't even dared to whisper. "Yes, Levi," she breathed. "Yes, I will marry you." Their wedding was a simple affair in the small-town church, but it felt like a grand celebration. The whole valley seemed to turn out. Even Martha, the nosy neighbor, was there, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, her gossip finally silenced by the undeniable reality of their happiness. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Levi leaned down to kiss her, a cheer erupted from the congregation. They returned to the ranch as a true family, bound by vows of honesty and a love that had been forged in the fire of a terrible truth. Their life together was a testament to second chances. They prayed together each morning, their voices united in gratitude. Grace's love for Rosie blossomed, and the little girl thrived, secure in the love of two parents. The house was no longer a cage of secrets, but a home filled with laughter and the scent of baking bread. A year passed, a turn of the seasons that saw their love deepen and their family grow. With the first signs of spring came the news that Grace was expecting. The joy on the ranch was boundless. Levi treated her like precious glass, his love for her now mingled with a fierce, protective tenderness that was beautiful to behold. When her time came, it was in the deep of night. Levi was at her side, his hand holding hers, his voice a low murmur of prayer and encouragement. He would not fail her. He would not leave her side. After hours of labor, a new, strong cry filled the room. A vibrant sound of life that washed away the last lingering shadows of the past. "It's a boy," the midwife announced, placing the swaddled infant into Grace's arms. Levi knelt beside the bed, tears of gratitude streaming down his face. He looked from his son's face to his wife's, his heart so full it felt like it might burst from his chest. "Thank you," he whispered, pressing a reverent kiss to her forehead. Later, as the sun rose, Rosie was brought in to meet her new brother. She peered at the tiny bundle in awe. "He's so little," she whispered. Then she looked up at Grace, her face serious. "I will help you take care of him, Mama." The word, offered so naturally, was a final, perfect blessing. They named their son Joseph, he will add, a testament to the blessing God had added to the family he had so beautifully pieced back together. As Levi sat in the rocking chair he had built, holding his son, with Grace resting nearby and Rosie leaning against his knee, he finally understood. A happy ending wasn't a life without storms. It was having a love strong enough to weather them. Together. The story of the mail-order bride and the grieving rancher was over. In its place was the story of Levi and Grace. A story of redemption. A testament to the truth that even the most broken hearts can be made whole again. If you were touched by this story of faith and second chances, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more tales of hope from the heart of the Wild West. New stories are always just around the bend.